Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone enjoyed yesterday. Netco was certainly on the move, and thank you for being part of our growth. We have another day filled with great speakers and our education sessions. These conferences require an immense amount of planning. Thank you to our staff and the team from Evoke for their hard work on putting together such a successful conference. These conferences only happen with the help of our supporters, of our sponsors, and I want to again recognize them and thank each of them. Our theme sponsor, Saskatchewan Polytechnic, our prestige sponsors, Stanley DeWalt Black & Decker, IBW Local 2085, and the Joint Electrical Promotion Plan. Our platinum sponsors, IBW Local 353, our social media sponsors, the Electrical Contractors Association of Alberta, our gold sponsors, the American Technical Publishers, Milwaukee Tool, Electricity Human Resources Canada, IBW Local 37, and the Canadian Council of Directors of Apprenticeship. Our silver sponsor, IBW Local 804, and our green champion sponsors, IBW Local 353, IBW Local 37, and the Atlantic Wiremen's Council. We are pleased to provide each delegate that attends the education sessions with a certificate of participation in the coming weeks, as well as a certificate of attendance for being part of our conference. Thank you to our funding partners for continuing to value Netco. For those that are not Netco partners, our doors are open and we are happy to talk with you. So please don't hesitate to contact Melissa. I think this year's conference is a clear display that Netco has a role to play for the entire electrical industry. Again, I want to extend congratulations to Adrian Livingston, this year's recipient of the Netco Leadership of Excellence Award. As we kick off day 2, I want to again thank everyone for their participation. These conferences are only as successful as the people that attend them. On behalf of the Netco Board of Directors, I wish you an exciting day at the conference, and thank you.
Thank you, David. And thanks so much to Netco for having me. I very much appreciate it. My name is Mark Chapeskie. I'm here today on behalf of Electricity Human Resources Canada, an organization dedicated to ensuring Canada has the workforce to keep the lights on in the country, a workforce that is safety focused, highly skilled, diverse, and productive. The focus for today's discussion is going to be the transformation of work in the electricity industry in the context of several factors that have an impact on how we plan for the workforce of the future. To start though, I hope everyone is safe, healthy, and well, ideally vaccinated if possible. I have to acknowledge that it has been a tough year for everyone. And as I speak to you from my basement office / spare bedroom, I hope you will all continue to be safe and well. A quick housekeeping item, please put any questions you may have in the Q&A box in the bottom of your Zoom feature, and I will get to them at the end of the presentation once I've gone through. So we are leaving behind a fairly stable, steady state workforce status that has been roughly the same for the past couple of decades in both skills and competency mix and relative size. Technological innovation and adoption is having an impact on nearly every occupation in the sector. We have every reason to believe this has been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Climate change is having an impact on electricity infrastructure in 2 ways. The first is the increase in adverse weather events, and the second is a societal push and consequent public policy moving towards a net zero economy, which will of course include electrification. And of course, the labor force itself is changing. The makeup of this sector demographically will need to change to keep up. So to start, I think it makes sense to discuss the current status of the workforce. The electricity industry in Canada at last comprehensive count was about 108,000 people, according to EHRC's most recent Power in Motion report. a number that has been relatively steady since EHRC started tracking it in 2006. Now, I must emphasize that this number forms the traditional core generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity workforce in Canada. However, we have finally hit the baby boomer cliff. While the national retirement rate was 2% across industries in Canada, the sector's retirement rate at last count was almost 3%, or 1.5 times the national average. Another interesting note, while retirements have increased, so too has reliance on external contractors for key functions. Most employers relied on contractors 27% of the time as part of this study, up from 25% back in 2011. Lastly, on the subject of recruitment, 60% of employers recruit from each other in this sector. Some of us collectively refer to this, of course, as poaching, and 51% are recruiting from their own contractors. Still a bit of a poaching approach. Also watch out oil and gas and construction. Those are the other two most commonly approached sectors, but they form significantly lower components of recruitment. Many occupations within electricity do share skill sets with occupations from outside of the sector. And while the war for talent may have cooled down during COVID, once the economy more fully reopens, the labor market will be feeling the squeeze again. So as we are going through retirements, relying a little bit more on external contractors and recruiting from within, let's talk about the current makeup of the sector and where we can grow. So the workforce portrait. Women only make up about 26% of the industry. When we consider that the Canadian labor market is near parity, we have a long way to go, particularly in the trades. Some trades are as low as 1% to 2% women. Youth representation in the industry remains chronically low. 5% of the total labor force in the electricity industry in Canada is under the age of 25, but youth make up 14% of the labor force in all industries. This is an important thing to note as we discuss some of the other big changes the sector is facing when it comes to Canada's push to net zero carbon emissions. From our Generation Impact report, we know that youth are often completely unaware of careers in the industry. Newcomers to Canada, sometimes termed foreign-trained workers, which in my view is incorrect, since technically I'm a foreign-trained worker as I went to school in the US. Don't hold that against me, please. Anyway, we also have a long way to go in attracting this group to this industry as well, especially as we look at the demographics in Canada. We're not having enough babies, basically, domestically, to replace our current workforce. Most OECD or economically developed countries will actually see population decline by 2100, and in some cases, significant decline. And in fact, some of those instances, those populations are expected to have. As a result of immigration policy, Canada actually has a unique advantage here, but only if we can capture the skills of newcomers in occupations relevant to their experience, something that we do need to work on in this sector. Indigenous people, on the other hand, are 4.7% of the workforce with a high concentration in the trades, about 8%, which isn't bad when we compared with the national average. However, even here, we can also do better because electricity jobs are everywhere, unlike a number of other industries. They are as much rural as they are urban. And as we look at getting off diesel in rural and remote communities, we have to engage more Indigenous people in that transition. And on that note about population growth, the Indigenous population is the only other growing population in Canada. Now let's talk a little bit about persons with disabilities. They represent less than 3% of the electricity workforce. This is unfortunate because this demographic group represents an amazing opportunity for growth as and underemployment numbers here are chronically high. And research shows us that integration and inclusion of persons with disabilities does not have to be overly expensive or onerous. Often it means a solid evaluation of current job descriptions to see where accommodations can be made to align with ability. Fundamentally, the sector as a whole has a long way to go on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to be competitive with other industries, we won't have a choice. A little plug here for EHRC's Leadership Accord on Gender Diversity, the goal of which is to increase inclusion in the industry for all groups that may have been excluded. Of the workforce, 42% are in the trades: power line technicians, utility arborists, power systems operators, millwrights, industrial electricians, and welders make up a few. And our forecast in our 2018 report suggested that by 2019, demand would outstrip supply of apprentices coming out of the current system for most of the trades required by the sector. This was reinforced for us in the Work Transformed report we published the year before last, looking specifically at the impact of technology on occupations in the sector. Another 20% of occupations are engineers, electrical, mechanical, civil, think those big hydroelectric mega projects, for example, mechatronic. This is a relatively newer discipline, one that blends the electrical and mechanical disciplines, and even aviation and aerospace. Think of those rotating wind turbines, for example. A further 20% are technicians and technologists. The balance of roles, of course, are in corporate services, communications, marketing, finance, accounting, HR, and increasingly, very quickly increasingly, cybersecurity. There was a time when cybersecurity was something that only banks and big tech companies talked about. That is no longer the case. One of the greatest threats facing Canada's economy is the potential for nefarious actors to disrupt power supplies to key areas of the Canadian infrastructure for prolonged periods of time. This issue was underscored for me a couple of years ago when a little referenced article was published in the CBC in September of 2019, where NORAD Commander US Admiral William Gortney asked Canada's military to, in quotation marks, identify and mitigate cyber threats to critical civilian sites. The civilian sites of concern were, of course, water, gas, and electrical utilities specifically. But before I dive into further technological impacts, more on the state of the industry. The steady state status of the workforce has changed, as I said. The demands for new and evolving skills is increasing. I've heard employers increasingly refer to occupations as follows: super techs, dual ticket trades, multidiscipline engineers. Employers want employees that can do more. A few years ago, EHRC started a journey to map out every task, skill, competency, and occupation in the industry that is required to keep the lights on at the end of the day. We now have a competency framework that allows us to see with a high degree of clarity which competencies are required for the sector across occupations and employer types. They're broken down into three categories: foundational, consisting of those that are commonly shared across occupations, including safety, security, information communications technology, and personal or professional competencies. Functional or technical, which include design, construction, installation, power generation, transmission and distribution, asset maintenance, information communications technology again, and engineering. And lastly, the management competencies, which include things like project management, leadership, finance, and human resources. With this framework, EHRC is able to take a deep dive into different roles to see which roles share competencies with other roles. And this allows for efficiencies of training and upskilling initiatives. It allows for broader workforce planning to transition staff from one role to another. In the event one role is disappearing, think meter reader or thermal coal worker, for example, over the course of a period of years, the common language also allows for better informed pay equity discussions across roles. It informs training and curriculum development plans, and even custom job descriptions, picking and choosing from one competency stack to another. One of the interesting side benefits of this research was that we started to explore some experimental occupations. For example, several years ago, when we started this research, there was a lot of buzz around energy storage technicians and smart grid specialists and even EV charging station installers. As we dug deeper at the time, we realized these weren't actually occupations that existed. The functions or roles were being performed by existing technicians, technologists, and electricians in most cases. However, fast forward a couple of years to today, we are starting to see actual occupations emerge with the titles mentioned above and associated competencies. So energy storage technician, EV charging station installer, smart grid specialist. One of the more fascinating ones that we've only just started exploring is what kind of an impact small modular reactors will have on the skills landscape and workforce planning as the federal government invests in this area in alignment with some of the provinces. Since I've already started talking about technology anyway, we may as well start talking about the impact of technology more generally. One of the things EHRC did a couple of years ago was launch our Work Transformed report, which of course I mentioned earlier, in partnership with PwC Canada, which explored the impact of AI and automation on the roles within the electricity industry. Before anyone starts worrying about when and if the robots are out to take our jobs away, relax. Our findings from that report actually demonstrated that while robots, sensors, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and integrated systems are certainly having an impact, overall, we're looking at a net gain in employment rather than a net decrease. One of the interesting findings in this report, though, was how employers are planning to deal with the technological impact. There are two schools of thought that emerged right away. I refer to them as the retain and train school versus the fire and hire school. Under a train and retain plan, the idea is that employers recognize that they were in a tight labor market, i.e. supply and demand are pretty equally balanced, or if anything, supply is slightly low. So letting go of good people with sound corporate memory isn't smart. They're better off identifying transferable skill sets and upskilling their workforce into new roles or existing roles with increased competency requirements than they are trying to find someone new. The second school of thought is the fire and hire school. As the name suggests, laying off existing workers that don't have the new information communication technology competencies required and hire someone else who does. Here's the thing about this sector, though. The ICT or information communication technology requirements are complicated by a factor little talked about outside of the or inside of the industry. We have essentially layered all kinds of digital technology on top of 30-year-old analog technology and made it all work together. Based on the demographic challenges above, I'll let you come to your own conclusions on this approach regarding the fire and rehire. But at the end of the day, very few employers have anything resembling a training plan in place, and nearly a third have no training plan at all to achieve the ICT skills needs of this sector. On the digital versus analog issue, I'm reminded of a nuclear example I came across a couple of years ago, not from Canada, thankfully. An operator accidentally pressed the shutdown button on a reactor, and the reactor shut down. It cost a whole pile of money and time to bring it back online again, but can anyone guess why there wasn't an "are you sure you want to shut down" Windows pop-up on that particular kill switch? Safety. If for safety reasons a reactor needs to be shut down, you better believe you don't want to frantically be clicking with a mouse to confirm the shutdown or waiting for Windows to respond. But I digress. The point. With regard to technology, this industry is uniquely complex. We have layered multiple software and digital hardware systems on top of analog hardware. It makes cybersecurity and the management of critical infrastructure more complicated than your typical tech startup, for example. So back to that ICT conundrum. I don't know about you, but I've actually worked in an ICT role in the past number of years in a management position. And I can tell you from experience that hiring in that labor market is a really tough slog. At last count, the unemployment rate was less than 1%. And that, by the way, has been consistent throughout the pandemic. If anything, it's gotten worse. It's been that way for a long, long time. Then during, of course, the pandemic, the companies that did really, really well were, of course, those that were online, digital, social connection making, and all of those require these ICT skill sets. Many firms have actually outsourced their web development requirements from Canada to the Philippines, Malaysia, India. So the ICT skills requirements are actually very complicated to hire in. This is especially true when competing against brand name companies like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Shopify, and yes, even Research in Motion. Have you seen what they are doing with security for automated cars, by the way? Fascinating stuff. This sector is very much in competition for ICT skills with other sectors. Back to the Work Transformed report. The technologies that are already having a specific impact across the Canadian economy fall into 4 categories: processing power and big data, automation of workplace tasks, cybersecurity and privacy, and the industrial Internet of Things. Many emerging digital technologies and innovations have applications unique to the sector. When asked to rank the technologies specific to the sector, respondents identified energy storage, renewable energy, and smart grid tech as top of mind to transform the sector's operations. We wanted to understand the drivers motivating change, and these 4, of course, were on top of the list. The technological changes are motivated largely by the need to improve energy efficiency, sustainability, reliability, and accessibility, all of which are key goals in the future of electricity production, distribution, and consumption. So markets and prices. As the prices for solar power, battery storage, wind power, electric vehicles, etc., continue to drop, the market for electricity products are becoming more and more competitive, allowing the emergence of new competing actors. The cycle of higher competition and increasingly lower prices will continue to accelerate the pace of transformation in the sector. Consumer preference and attitude as consumer attitudes toward climate change evolve, demand for renewable sources of electricity and energy efficient products and services are following, accelerating the pace and scope of change in the electricity industry. Climate change mitigation and decarbonization. A push to mitigate the effects of climate change is accelerating the decarbonization of global energy systems, with economies around the world electrifying their transportation, heating, and cooling systems. Government policies. The sector is influenced by government decisions, including policies in regulations that directly affect this industry. Change in government priorities can have a considerable impact on companies as they forecast change. When it comes to a timeline for change, the vast majority of respondents, or 80%, identified these 8 technologies that are affecting the sector far beyond any other business innovation. Cybersecurity and privacy. Because we are still using legacy technologies, as I had mentioned above, utilities in Canada are facing attempted cyber breaches on a daily basis. They employ sophisticated systems and teams to counter those threats. Homeland Security, a couple of years ago, issued a damning report in the United States that nearly every utility in the country had experienced some form of cyber breach or incident in the previous year. Similar data in Canada is hard to come by, but think of the personal data that your local utility maintains about you as well. Processing power and big data presents the industry with opportunities to improve the reliability of electricity supply and accuracy of energy demand. Think of the integration of smart meters and how electrical utilities and consequently electricity systems operators like the ISO in Ontario are now able to gather real-time electricity demand data. This was virtually impossible even 10 years ago. Remember when a meter reader came out to look at the meter on your house? New generation of electricity can be spun up or down as needed in real time. Maintenance can be performed during downtime on critical generation infrastructure when sensors identify a weakness developing before a catastrophic system failure, saving literally thousands of dollars in downtime on a generation technology during peak demand hours. Automation of workplace tasks or robotic process automation. Increased use of AI-powered automation is absolutely necessary when we think about the sheer quantity and volume of data available to us. The powerhouse of data analysts that would be required to go through data points and find patterns with the volume of sensors and other equipment that monitors the infrastructure in real time means that the volume of data can only be managed with the assistance of computers and AI. Drones. I love this one. They collect high quality data to help identify faulty equipment. And it's a fascinating one, by the way. One of the ongoing debates in the industry is who's responsible to fly the drone. Historically, the power line technicians would fly the transmission lines and photograph them and geotag them accordingly. Then the data analyst would review and an engineer would assess replacement and maintenance of towers and or tree branch removal for interference with the transmission lines. Enter drones. Who should fly? The PLT, the engineer, the data analyst? I don't have an answer, but those are the kinds of discussions that are ongoing. And honestly, I think it's because they all think drones are cool. Industrial Internet of Things. Pardon me. To coordinate the automation of activities, going back to the sensor example, it used to be that maintenance of generation equipment was performed according to the manufacturer's specifications, but these are estimates. What happens if something doesn't last quite as long as expected? A generation component wears out because it's slightly out of sync. With increased sensor use, companies can now tell if something is going to require maintenance sooner and thus plan for it, saving all kinds of money to avoid a system failure during peak demand, which can be a lot more expensive. 3D printing. This one is interesting. It can be used for three-dimensional models, but there is even an example in Australia where it was used to print a solar field. Virtual reality and augmented reality. There have been some fascinating examples of this used for training purposes in the industry. It's also great to build awareness for students while they're in elementary and high school. A great example from McMaster University that uses a Google Cardboard VR box. Slide in a smartphone and tour the inside of a CANDU nuclear reactor core. That's not something most people get to see every day. Artificial intelligence. As mentioned earlier, with the Internet of Things, there is just too much data to crunch for one or even two data analysts to get through it all and make sense of it. We need computer AI to assist in this area. Now, those are all technologies that are affecting the economy more broadly, with specific examples in the electricity industry. When we think about technologies affecting this sector more specifically, respondents argued that the following were already having or going to have an impact on the electricity industry: renewable energy sources, smart meters, smart grid tech, in particular, and electrification of transportation, and of course, improvement in energy storage. However, when we asked about the timeline for change, there was some uncertainty on when the impact would be felt. Renewables, smart meters, and smart grid come out on top, with most saying they are already having an impact and very close to full agreement that if the tech isn't already having an impact, they will in the next 3 years maximum. Of note, this report was published 2 years ago, and we've had a pandemic since then, so allow that to sink in. More to come on that too. Electrification of transportation improvements in energy storage, and Internet of Things integration fall down the list when it comes to the timeline for change. But again, the majority say they are already impacting or will within the 3 years. Even more say to expect change within 5 years, and I think we can all agree the writing is on the wall. I'll call out electrification of transportation as an example. Most major car companies and more than a few new players, think NIO or Electromechanica, which is pictured here, are now touting a fully electrified line of vehicles within the next several years. Tesla has big competition on the horizon as EVs start rolling out nationwide and internationally. BC and Quebec and Canada have led the charge on EV adoption, largely because of generous rebate programs on first purchase. To underscore just how unprepared the electricity grid is for broad-scale EV adoption, can anyone tell me where one gets trained to become an EV charging station installer? That's rhetorical. EHRC has actually just published the standard on this at the end of April that outlines the core skills requirements and the foundational occupational requirements. Of note, it's 110 pages long. The truth is, this role is being performed by a variety of individuals currently, mostly technicians, technologists, and electricians with some upskilling. But currently, Canada doesn't have a standard for training in this area. Equally scary, we don't have one for solar PV or solar thermal installer either. Good news on that front, though, is that we just published those too. Now let's spend some time on the impact on work. We know that there are new requirements for ICT skills in the workforce across all occupations. In fact, when we designed our competency framework, one of the new foundational skills is information and communications technology. However, very few employers have training plans or programs in place that fully address their workforce skills needs related to tech change. And a third have no training plan at all. My take? The robots aren't coming. They cannot and will not be displacing the broad electricity workforce anytime soon. According to that same Work Transformed report, we had an interesting finding with regard to trades. If we asked stakeholders about the impact of technology on trades generally, there was an even split about increase or decrease in demand. However, we also asked about increased demand of power line technicians, arborists, power systems operators, millwrights, industrial electricians, and welders. And in every instance, respondents overwhelmingly stated these would be in-demand occupations. What we learned from this as an organization is we can't ask the generic trades questions. People clearly don't know what they're talking about or haven't framed well in their minds what that means. The point, the robots may be coming, but it certainly isn't for trades jobs. The one thing this report does tell us is that trades roles are becoming increasingly more sophisticated, and the technical requirements for competency success are integrating more technology. Interesting to note, of course, that both previous reports were published before some big changes in federal public policy started to roll out nationally over the past couple of years, and particularly since the pandemic. Now, enter COVID. As we all know, electricity is an essential service, and as such, it had to keep going so that people could continue to heat their homes, turn on their lights, cook their meals, and those businesses that could operate could continue to do so. And let's not forget about the electricity needs of hospitals and grocery stores. This is not a sector where much of the workforce can, in quotation marks, work from home. When an ice storm hits, lines people respond. Also, could you imagine the cybersecurity implications of being able to remote in to the operations center and monitor and update power flow into the electricity grid, there's a job you can't do from your basement. From our Powering Through Together report issued in the fall, we know that safety was double underscored, bolded, and highlighted in every decision made by the sector for their workforce. Pivots to work remotely, physically distanced, and with appropriate PPE were made in alignment with existing pandemic response plans where possible, mostly in the GTA or the Greater Toronto Area as a result of the SARS outbreak a few years ago, but more often innovatively in alignment with other business continuity plans that were in place to deal with natural disasters that are far more commonplace to the sector. From a workforce perspective, EHRC has anecdotal evidence to suggest that workers that were close to retirement may in fact have started to exit earlier than anticipated. Remember that retirement rate that's at 1.5 times the national average? We have reason to believe that may have accelerated as a result of COVID. Imagine you're a lines person for 30 plus years. You're approaching retirement. You're in an at-risk group of over 60, and you're supposed to be interacting with others in the public. Wouldn't you want to retire early too? The other big change, or the other big thing that came out of the Powering Through Together report, technological adoption and adaptation occurred virtually overnight. Several respondents stated to us that ICT projects they had been putting off for years were suddenly live in months because they stopped allowing the perfect to get in the way of the good enough. They started to take a more iterative approach to implementation. They had to. Increases in automation of services were named, improved IT delivery, increasing cybersecurity across business units was repeatedly mentioned. Interestingly, one of the impacts named by a number of organizations was how to maintain corporate culture, especially when some occupations went to full-time remote. Communication was cited repeatedly here. Lastly, one of the early reactions in the pandemic was hiring freezes and slowdowns. As a short-term solution to workforce management, this makes sense. But should those freezes or hiring slowdowns have continued for any length of time, that could have a significant impact on future productivity requirements. Remember that retirement rate? It doesn't just go away. And as I mentioned, we believe it has accelerated. We are now deep into a third wave in much of Canada, and only time will tell if hiring slowdowns will occur again. Now let's talk about climate change. It's real. Electricity grid operators see the impacts of climate change regularly. When a forest fire hits in BC or Alberta, the grid is impacted. When a group of tornadoes rips through a substation in Ottawa, the grid is impacted. When a hurricane batters the East Coast, the grid is impacted. Or when an ice storm hammers infrastructure in Quebec, the grid is impacted. According to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, those adverse weather events are increasing in Canada, and with them come costs. I mean, the Insurance Bureau would know. They underwrite a lot of them. Look at the electricity system meltdown in Texas this year as a result of a particularly cold weather spell that brought with it snow and ice that very few predicted. Well, some would argue that was entirely predictable, but that's neither here nor there for today. Being without power for days is something most Canadians don't regularly have to experience. We also tend to have a tougher winters here, though. So imagine the impact a prolonged outage would have mid-January in Ottawa, for example, where I am. And because climate change is real, there's an increasing societal push to reduce carbon emissions in our atmosphere. And that societal push has now started to turn into policy. The current federal government has committed to net zero by 2050. There are also aggressive targets to achieve by 2030. One thing I'd like to point out is that Canada actually has a relatively clean electricity grid when compared to its peer nations around the world. In fact, Ontario has the 4th most carbon-free electricity grid in the world. That's quite a statement. 80% of electricity generation is already carbon-free nationwide, and that will be 90% by 2030 as the final coal plants in Canada shutter. There is, of course, work to do, as there is in many sectors, but a lot of that work has actually already been done. But electricity consumption only makes up 20% of all energy consumption in Canada. The other 80% comes from transportation, building heating and cooling, and others, which tend to be very carbon intensive at present. Even a partial electrification of this other 80% of energy consumption is going to have a significant impact on workforce requirements. We need to start now to develop plans for roles like energy storage technician, smart grid analyst, solar PV installer, grid cybersecurity specialist, wind power technician, and others, some of which we haven't even dreamed up yet. Small modular reactors, as I mentioned earlier, proposed as one of the latest strategies from the federal government to solve some of the off-diesel problem in rural and remote communities, while innovative and interesting, and yes, very powerful and carbon-free, do present unique labor market challenges. The average time to full competency for many nuclear roles is 10 full years. The plan to bring SMRs to market at present is about 10 years. So we need to start planning for those roles now too. Then, in order to build out existing infrastructure to handle the increased electricity demand from things like electric vehicles, we need to ensure we have enough tradespeople, technicians, technologists, and engineers. To demonstrate just how not ready the grid is, an example from Alberta. A local utility ran a pilot to see what would happen if everyone on one street had an electric car. You can imagine everyone came home at around 5:30 p.m., plugged in their car, and immediately blew the transformer on the street corner. The grid just isn't ready for full EVs just yet, but there are options. EVs are just great big moving batteries that sit in parking lots or driveways 95% of the time. We only drive our cars 5% of the time, and often less that we own them. If that's the case, and we can build software programs and algorithms that allow us to access EVs as a network of energy storage devices, we can suddenly even out some of the challenges with adoption of full wind or solar power, which, by the way, is cheaper generation technology now than any other form. EVs can also be programmed only to charge in off-peak hours, i.e. in the middle of the night when there is less electricity demand, to help even out the demand requirements as well. So it's starting to feel like we've entered a perfect storm. For years, economists have been saying the boomers are retiring. At last quantitative count, the rate in this sector was approaching 3%, or 1.5 times the national average. And as I mentioned, we have reason to believe because of the pandemic, this has now accelerated. Because of this, traditional recruitment approaches relied on for decades will no longer be as effective. Companies in this sector are now competing for skills in digital technologies with companies like Google, Facebook, and others. And digital skills need to be trained into almost every role in the industry. Most organizations largely lack a comprehensive training plan or plan to do so. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, to reach workers beyond the norm will have to become commonplace. The war for talent between nations and between industries will heat up again as the economy reopens post-pandemic. Climate change is putting additional pressure on the grid, and grid resiliency at the same time. Policy to address decarbonization is leaning on electrification as one of the solutions. That means growing the existing workforce to respond to increased electricity demand. Fundamentally, it's a perfect storm of increasing demand and insufficient supply using traditional recruitment and retention approaches across roles. So we do have work to do as an industry. Canada is on the path to a decarbonized future. The only way we get there as a nation is going to be through things like electrification. And the only way to do that is build out the capital infrastructure and, yes, the human capital workforce to allow us to do that. It's a nation building project unlike any we've had in recent history. It will require standard occupational definitions, workforce transitions from within and from outside of the sector, and it will require newly trained people in occupations that are just emerging and core occupations that already exist. But with an overlay of information and communication technology skills, it will require recruitment from demographic groups that the sector has only just started to address as well. And at Electricity Human Resources Canada, we're used to tackling some of these big problems, and we have some ideas for all of it. In fact, we've already started on some of them, so stay tuned, stay connected. We're not going anywhere, and we've got some big ideas on how to engage multi-generations of talent and bring them into Canada's electricity industry. For now, thank you for listening to me. Thank you, Netco, for having me. My name is Mark Chapeskie. I'm Vice President of Program Development, and I'm here today on behalf of Electricity Human Resources Canada, an organization dedicated to ensuring Canada has the workforce to keep the lights on in the country, a workforce that is safety-focused, highly skilled, diverse, and productive. And now, one that is and will be a big part of Canada's energy transition with a future-ready workforce. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up the Q&A to see if there are any questions. So the first question, I'll just read it out so everybody can see it. Why are energy storage technicians, EV charging station techs, solar PV installers, wind power techs, and smart grid specialists being referenced as separate trades? All of this work currently falls under the role of an electrician. How is it to the advantage of industry to identify these separately? Industry and employers need more versatility, i.e. dual trades, not more silos of specialized trades that may or may not have a long-term future. I guess the quick answer to that question is EHRC typically doesn't get involved in how employers and unions and the individual trades determine when a new trade is required. What we do is we identify roles as we see them emerging. And typically what we see, and these occupational standards are available on our website now. Some of the roles that I mentioned, like the EV charging station, solar PV installers, wind power techs, et cetera, some of them, to the point of the questioner, are in fact stacked on existing roles like electricians. So it just means that that specific role that we're talking about may actually require additional upskilling to perform in this new way specifically. So if we take EV charging station installer, for example, they may have a baseline electrician trade ticket, for example, but they may require some upskilling to actually do the EV charging station installs. That is probably the simplest way to define it. But I would encourage anyone who's interested to have a look at some of those national occupational standards and the associated documents that they come with. The next question that has come in, I'm curious what suggestions you have for employers supporting workers with disabilities. What are the most common disabilities we see among tradespeople and prospective tradespeople? And how can we better support the people with these disabilities on the jobs? Thanks. And that's from Alistair. Alistair, thanks for this question. I have to admit, I am not an expert on the integration of persons with disabilities. One thing I can say is that this is an area that there are others who do have expertise in. And so for those organizations that are interested in exploring what it might look like to integrate somebody in the workforce with a disability, there are, Live, Work, Play, or Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, or there are others out there. The one thing I would say is that disability is a broad spectrum. And so sometimes in our minds, we have a very specific understanding of what that means. There are both visible and invisible disabilities. And sometimes the workforce accommodations are smaller than we think. I know that I read a report recently from an initiative here in Ottawa called Able To. And they actually found that in many instances, and this is not specific to trade, so I know I'm getting slightly off topic on the trades discussion, but in many instances, it's actually very easy to integrate persons with disabilities with some tweaks to the requirements of the job, or with some accommodation technology. In fact, they managed to put a dollar value on what those accommodations looked like. And for the average, it was about $1,200 per employee for accommodations. And that was it, like one time, $1,200. But for those that are interested, I would definitely encourage speaking to organizations that specialize in this particular area. And then from Melissa, Netco, she mentions that Netco does have the only EV ITP charging station program certified in Canada. And Netco was consulted on the standards, and she's absolutely right about that. When we put together the charging station, the EV charging station installer, NOS, Netco was a great participant and very, very helpful as we put that NOS together. And in fact, I believe it references the Netco work in it. So if anyone has any additional questions, I unfortunately can't actually see my time. I'm a little ahead of time, actually. If there are no additional questions, I'll just wait another minute. Okay. Well, we've probably all got about 15 minutes to go have a washroom break or grab a glass of water or whatever it is before we move on to our next session. So again, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening to the talk today. Thank you so much. And if anyone does have any follow-up questions, you can reach out to me directly or via Melissa and Netco. I am more than happy to be available to have a conversation or trade emails. Thanks again to Melissa and Netco. Thank you all for listening to me today. I really hope you enjoy the day. Stay healthy and stay safe.